I know you're as excited as I am that we've finally reached the battle in the hall. And here we are. We've had all the mounting tension, the building of the kind of suspense through books 13 to 21. And finally, we get to the battle in the hall. You remember book 21? Odysseus has strung the bow. The suitors are looking at him, slightly surprised at what's going on. And we then come to book 22. So in the overview, key events are divided to three areas. Firstly, the killing of Antinous and Eurymachus and the capture of Melanthius. So there's an individual focus to start with. Fascinating, what a start this is to book 22. I just love this opening bit where Odysseus stands there. Antinous had just reached for his fine cup to take a draught of wine, and the golden two-handled beaker was balanced in his hands. No thought of bloodshed enters his head. Antinous is just looking curiously, holding his wine, thinking, shall I have a sip? What's going on here? And at that moment, suddenly everything kicks off, doesn't it? And Odysseus shoots him through the throat. Note that both with Antinous and Eurymachus, when they die, their feet lash out and kick the table and kick the food and the wine into the floor, both line 20 and line 85. They are surrounded by the cause of their own death. Their gluttony and their greed for food and drink is what causes their death. So there's an individual focus. Secondly, there's a generalized focus where there's the battle with the rest of the suitors. And in that, there's a back and forth, isn't there, where first Odysseus and Telemachus attack, then there's a fight back by the other suitors, and finally the victory for Odysseus. So we go through from an individual focus to start with, and you get almost like a kind of a close-up lens on things. Then it's almost as if the camera pans out so you can watch the whole battle, and then there's a restoring of order at the end, 390 to 501. So 390 to 501, what happens is that then the disloyal servants are killed, be they the maids or the servants, and then the house is restored, and Odysseus demands that immediately the hall is purified with fire and sulfur and stuff. So there's our shape to book 22. Individual focus, generalized focus, restoration of the social focus. With regard to the servants, I think this is really interesting that Melanthius gets an enormous amount of prominence. I don't know if you've actually, when reading through book 22, you've noticed this, but actually, in book 22, a quarter of the book goes to the servants, 124 of the 501 lines. And you wouldn't expect this, would you? You'd think, the servants, they're just background figures, they're not very important. Actually, they're the ones who get an enormous amount of prominence. Now, why is that? What's the reason for that? And clearly it comes down to loyalty, doesn't it? That actually the servants either assist Odysseus or they have betrayed Odysseus. And it's really important for understanding how the Homeric world works, that we've got this sense that the servants are critical to it. If your servants are disloyal, if they're out of control, then that's going to ruin your society. Whereas if your servants are in their proper place, your society is going to work. And that's why loyalty is so highly prized. And that's why, indeed, for the oikos, the Greek household family, that includes everybody, not just your blood relatives, but all those who are part of your wider family, which includes the servants. And we'll explain why people like Euryclea, Eumaeus feel part of the family. And also where Melantho's betrayal is so bad, isn't it? She was treated like a daughter by Penelope, but she betrayed that. Thirdly, we've got Homer's style and his narrative techniques. Now, if you look at the double simile in line 297 to 309, it gives a real sense of the horror of the battle. So look at the three things we've got here. We've got the first one, which is the herd of cattle. Secondly, we've got the vultures. And then thirdly, we've got the spectators. So here's the cattle, here's the vultures, here's the spectators. Interesting to start with, the simile is that the suitors are terrified by Athene, who comes with her deadly aegis as a sort of shield weapon thing. And that terrifies the suitors. Even though they have the enormous numbers, they're scared by a tiny thing. Really cleverly chosen simile, isn't it? The large is scared by the small. Cattle don't like a gadfly is a fly that comes and buzzes around and stings and bites the bigger creature. So it only takes this small fly to startle the suitors. And then Homer, I think this is the brilliant thing. He flips the simile altogether, doesn't he? And so from being the cattle, a herd of cattle, enormous great thing, the suitors suddenly become the smaller birds. So they've been large and they're scared by a small thing. And now they are the many, but they are chased by the few. And they move from being apparently the substantial side of things into the smaller side of things. Odysseus and Telemachus and their allies, they become the vultures, or another translation, the eagle, and they swoop down. So even though they're well outnumbered, they are the predator, and they've moved into this predatory position. And then there's even this interesting thing which actually Homer's sort of suggesting for ourselves. The vultures pounce on them and kill. And then there's this really interesting phrase, and men enjoy the hunting. And Homer's almost saying to us, we should be in that state. We're watching, and we should enjoy the fact that now judgment is coming upon the suitors. Which leads us to that final line. Ghastly screams rose up as men's heads were smashed in and the whole floor ran with blood. So there's a horror of cattle who are moving into stampede. There's a horror of birds desperately trying to escape from a predator that is coming and that they can't escape from. And then there's the blood everywhere. There's a very vivid description of the battle. And then finally, characterization. Now, this leads us to a really difficult issue, doesn't it? Odysseus and Telemachus kill the servants. So what does it tell us about them? Is it justified? Now, both take a ruthless revenge, don't they? Odysseus asks for details on who's betrayed him. He says, tell me who's been disloyal to me. And Telemachus says, they've heaped insult on my head and my mother's, and they've slept with the suitors, when he's telling about the maids. So that is the revelation of their betrayal. Odysseus says that his actions are absolutely fine because they're part of the will of the gods. And he's saying that this is all part of things. And that actually the judgment comes because the gods want it. So the key is that the suitors have acted as if the Odysseus was dead, and there couldn't be any judgment on their actions. And therefore, the servants who've gone with them have betrayed the gods, haven't they? So suitors acted as if Odysseus was dead. Some of the servants went with the suitors and acted as if Odysseus was dead. And so what Odysseus says is that I'm bringing judgment, but not for myself, but for the gods. Even if the gods don't seem to be present, they can't be ignored. In the same way that even though Odysseus wasn't present, he can't be ignored. There's a really interesting moral lesson, isn't it? Just because the person who's in charge isn't there doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing what you're told. Well, that's an interesting lesson for our own educational background, I would suggest, as a closing thought to today. So book 22, the servants and the suitors finally come to judgment, and Odysseus has finally triumphed in the palace.